Welcome to Troubleshooting Zen Study and Practice number 40. This month, in working with the fires, you say that this process burns away the sense of self. Can you unpack this comment a bit more? Also, where does this practice come from? Would you also just go through the process of how to work with the fires, please? So we have a 3-in-1 question, but all on the same subject of working with the fires. And we have looked at this subject before, obviously, in a number of talks, but it is quite a complex one, and it's certainly one that does raise a lot of questions in the minds of practitioners, people who are studying and practicing Zen, and it's pivotal. It really is very important as part of the Zen training. And certainly when my own late teacher, Venerable Myokyo-ni, Master Daiyu Myokyo, she said, really without it, the transformation of the heart cannot take place. Literally to quote her, she said, in the Zen practice, any spiritual practice that does not take into account the emotional household, sometimes known as the passions, sometimes known as the fires, sometimes known as the poisons, these are Buddhist translations of Buddhist terms, that does not take into account these fires, doesn't bring any lasting change. In other words, working with the emotional household is key to the transformation of the heart. And this is the transformation of the suffering heart to the heart that is released, that can enter nirvana, and that it is also overflowing with the Buddha's wisdom and compassion, the warmth of heart. So that transformation process, that alchemy of transformation. And we'll see that term alchemy will appear a little bit later on in the explanation. So, a number of different things to get through today. So we will plough on. So first of all, I'm going to look at that second question. Where does this actual practice come from? And I think the reason that this question is raised, and I've heard this raised from a number of people who have been reading, studying and practicing Zen for quite a while, is a lot of people say that I've not actually heard of this before. I've not come across this before, and therefore begin to wonder if this is perhaps a practice that Myokyo-ni herself developed and taught to her students. And I think that first of all, I'd like to scotch that one because Myokyo-ni was very clear that the teaching of Zen that she gave to her students here in the West was what she herself, was the Zen that she was taught in her 12 years in Japan. And she trained at Daitokuji Monastery in Kyoto from between 1960 and 1972. And she was given Inka, which meant that she was given the full authority to teach by her second teacher. And she had two teachers. First one was Master Sesso, who was Lord Abbot of Daitokuji, and he died, I think it was around 66. And after that, Sojun Roshi took over. And it was under Sojun Roshi that she completed her training and received Inka from him. And she always used to tell the story that quite early on in her training, when she met Sesso Roshi, her first teacher, whom she was very close to actually, and she had tremendous warmth for, and she spoke of with great affection. She said that one day he sat her down and said to her, speaking to her as a Westerner, as a sort of Western student who had come to Japan, he reassured her and said, look, the Zen that I teach is the Zen that was taught to me by my teacher, Master Zwegan. And the Zen that he was taught to him by his teacher. And then he mentioned Zwegan's teacher. And Zwegan's teacher got it from his teacher, and his teacher got it from his teacher. And he went through the whole of the lineage from memory backwards right the way to the Buddha and said, and Mahakasyapa got his Zen from the Buddha. And he was really at pains to point out that link. All the way back to the Buddha, even though Buddhism has, obviously journeyed through several countries and through many centuries, right up to the present day. But he was really keen to point out that what she was getting was not something made up, not something novel, which is not to say that Buddhism hasn't developed over that period of time. Obviously it had. What he was pointing out were the fundamental principles are the same. and they operate on the same understanding, even though the methods used in Buddhism and throughout the different schools, from Tantra to Vipassana through to Koan to mantras, mantrayanas, and all the other things that are there in Buddhism. Yes, the methods may be different, but the principles and the understanding of the problem and the way out of the problem of suffering, remains the same. And all those practices, their meaning derives from that understanding that the Buddha gave. And this was the point. And so, when she came west, the Zen that she taught was based on exactly the same principles. The other thing that also needs to be said is that the principle of working with the emotional household, because as she said, it is pivotal in Zen practice, did not come from her, and it did not come from Master Sesso. And we can see that for ourselves if we simply go back to the Pali Canon. If we go and have a look at the Satipatthana Sutta, or the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, the four foundations of mindful awareness, as they're commonly called, short sutta, to use the Pali term, where the Buddha lays out quite succinctly not only the instructions for Zazen, which is sitting meditation, which he does right at the beginning. He then goes on to give the what we call daily life practice, what he calls the four foundations of mindful awareness. And this is the part where, he says that the first foundation is the foundation of the body. When the monk is walking, he knows he's walking. When he stretches out his arm, he knows he's stretching out his arm. All that, and then he goes on with the second foundation, which is feeling sensation, which is a mind element or mind object. When he's experienced something pleasant, he knows he's experiencing something pleasant. When he's experiencing something unpleasant, he knows he's experiencing something unpleasant. And then he goes on to the third foundation, which is called the foundation of Chitta, commonly translated as mind. We tend to translate it as heart. And this is awareness of the heart. And so here, when anger arises in the heart of the monk, he knows that anger is arising. When it's not arising, he knows it is not arising. When his heart is concentrated, he knows his heart is concentrated. When it's dissolute and dispersed, he knows that it's dissolute and dispersed. And it's this third one. This is where the working with the emotional household is taking place, because there's a formula that runs through the whole of the Satipatthana with all the four foundations that finishes saying that the monk the monk, having given up covetousness and fear having given up covetousness for the world and also anxiety and fear of it, or dislike of it, then he is practicing this. And what we're seeing with that grasping and that rejection, having given up both of those things, that the Buddha is talking about a middle way, because those are two opposites. Grasping and rejecting, grasping and pushing away are the two extremes. And the Buddha is saying, in order to practice these four foundations, including mindful awareness of the emotional household, we have to give up the grasping, that is the chasing after the object of desire. We also have to give up the running away from the object of fear and of anxiety and loathing as well. And therefore what we are left with is staying with the emotion itself, staying with the desire, the lust, staying with the anger or the fear or the hatred, without being carried away by the object, either chasing after it or seeking to destroy or run away from it. So this is where the basic formula for working with the fires, working with the emotional household comes from. And he says, this is the only way, O monks, for the overcoming of sorrow, the overcoming of lamentation, the overcoming of selfishness, and the attainment of nirvana, and the attainment of wisdom as well, the wisdom of anatta, the wisdom of no I, which is, obviously one of the three signs of being that the Buddha taught, along with suffering and all things being subject to change. So this is the basis for this practice, and I think that's really, I really want to make that point, that this is not something novel. However, how it gets interpreted and the imagery and the analogies and so forth, those things do change. Obviously they change because, we are not living 2,500 years ago in northeast India, which is where the Buddha was teaching. And so there may be other analogies and there may be other metaphors and other symbolism that might be more useful for us to get those same principles across, so that we can begin our own working with the fires. So Satipatthana Sutta, there's the lineage, and right the way up to the present day. And this is what Master Dayu Myokyo Ni taught. And for people who are interested in this, I really couldn't advocate more strongly her book called Gentling the Bull by Myokyo Ni. Gentling the Bull by Myokyo Ni, which is available from the Zen Centre in London. A quick shout out there for the Zen Centre in London. If you put in Shoboan, SHOBO-AN, and put Rinzai London, it'll come up, and you just go and have a look under the publications, the books. You will find Gentling the Bull by Myokyo Ni. It's not expensive, it's very cheap. It's her commentary on the bull herding pictures and also her translation of the poems and verses. Well worth, because that really contains the core of what she taught around this subject of working with the fires. And it's if you're serious about Zen practice, and if you're serious about working with the fires, working with the emotional household, and experiencing this for yourself, that is a book I couldn't advocate more strongly to have in your bookshelf. You can go back to it again and again. Okay, so having said something about that, where it came from, the next thing I wanted to add, obviously, is how she taught it, in particular, and how she taught it to people like myself and her other students. Myokyo Ni as well also had a strong interest in the psychology of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, someone whose psychology is quite well known, maybe not as well known as Sigmund Freud. He was obviously a student of Sigmund Freud, and then there was a famous split, and then Jung went off and developed his own psychology called analytical psychology, and she was very familiar with analytical psychology, and she was particularly interested in some of the symbolism that Jung used around this subject, because he obviously also was interested in the transformation of the psyche, as he called it, what was known in as the individuation process. There's a couple of other troubleshooting Zen study and practice podcasts on this. You can go and look those up. In fact, the last one was on the archetypes of the collective unconscious, which is another Jungian term. And Jung also did a lot of research around the subject of alchemy, along with his student Marie-Louise von Franz, who also did a lot of work around fairy tales as well. But also she did the research for him for his publications on alchemy. And he was very interested in Western alchemy, in particular the symbolism of fire. And obviously, we've been talking about the fires. Interesting that we have that analogy, that's similar sort of usage, because it describes metaphorically how the emotions are often experienced. And the use of fire, and in alchemy, the use of fire that's used for transformation, for transforming the lead into gold, or the creation of the elixir of life in some cases. That lead into gold obviously is not the literal transmutation of a physical metal. The lead is seen as the starting point, the heart that is afflicted with these fires, and the gold perhaps is more analogous to the nirvana, the wisdom and compassion, the shining precious metal. So it's the transformation process, and the fire is an essential part of that transformation process. So this is how Myokyoni used to explain this to her students, and I can, having heard sat through it many times, I can pretty much give it verbatim. So she would say, in the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha links together suffering and the cause of suffering, which are the attachments. Now, what are these attachments? The attachments are the presence in consciousness, in the psyche, in the heart, of states of a stuckness. Perhaps the best way to describe this is the way that we become fixated, and in particular what we become fixated or identified with is myself. That this is the ultimate, for the Buddha, was the ultimate attachment, the attachment to myself. And again, the Buddha in many places in the Pali Canon makes this clear. In the practice, for example, I can't remember which sutta it comes from, but in his description of the practice of the five skandhas, those five skandhas that make up a human being, body, sensation, perception, mental configurations, and consciousness. These are the five objects of reflection, and by going deeply into those, the practitioner realizes that there is nothing in there that is either permanent or separate, and thus realizes the emptiness of self, anatta. And in that realization of the emptiness of self is released from suffering. So the Four Noble Truths links together the release from the delusion of self, from the attachment to self, and suffering. So whilst the attachment to self is present in the psyche, is present in the heart or the mind, then we suffer as a consequence from. That is in essence what the teaching of the Four Noble Truths gives us as its diagnosis. So the release from the attachments is not just enough to say, well, from now on I shall not be attached, because I am the attachment. And in the same way as the saying goes that the eye that sees cannot see itself, the knife that cuts cannot cut itself, neither can the I, that's the pronoun I, release him or herself from himself or herself or themselves nowadays. So that is something that really is essential. This is, I cannot be laid down by an act of will, by an act of my will, because for obvious reasons it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, it's a tautology, and so another force, if you like, a force outside of I, is necessary in order to do this. And what is that force? What is that power? Hey, it's the power of the emotional household itself. And now we have that famous saying from the northern tradition, the passions are the Buddha nature, and the Buddha nature is the passions. So if we regard the Buddha nature, or the energy of the Buddha nature, as the vitality of all living things, it is the basic energy that creates forms, both physical forms and also structural forms of behavior and becoming and ceasing. And in fact, the Buddha nature itself is the Dharma in living beings. There's also the Dharma nature in non-living beings, but they're still one and the same. There aren't two dharmas. That's let's just say for our purposes that the Buddha nature underpins everything in the universe. That's the ground of all being, and all forms, light and dark, old and young, up and down, male and female, living and dead, everything arises from it and to it returns as well. Perhaps we can use that as a sort of a metaphor, just if we want to visualize something in that way. So the energy that is in the passions, such as as wanting or hatred or fear, is also fundamentally the energy of the Buddha nature. So this is how it's seen. So there is that correlation between the passions and the Buddha nature. What turns the Buddha nature into the passions? The attachment to I. In the presence of the attachment to I, in the presence of the attachments, the Buddha nature is warped and becomes the energy of the passion. So this is how it is seen in this formulation, this way of working. So that's what she used to explain. Therefore, she said, the only power that can erode that those sticky attachments, the attachments to oneself, is literally to be bathed in the fire of the emotions itself without running away from it and without getting carried off by it. Those are the two extremes. Remember, neither grasping for the object nor running away from it either. The actual living in the presence. And I'll give an example of this that she used to use. When she was librarian at the Buddhist Society in London in the 1970s, there was a man who came in, a very well-dressed, slim, middle-aged man who was there from South Africa. And his work took him around the world, and she got into conversation with him, and he was in London for business, and he said, I often come to London for business, he said, but I find it a city of temptations. He said, because it seems that on every street corner there is a wonderful bakery or patisserie, and the one thing that I have a weakness for are cream cakes, and as you can see, if I'm going to keep my figure, I can't be indulging too much in cream cakes. He says, so I'm leaving tomorrow, and I'm looking forward to going back home because we don't seem to have so many where I am, and I shall be away from this temptation. And again, he was obviously interested in Buddhism as well, so she talked to him a little bit about the fires and said, if you are willing to try an experiment, then let me give you something. She said, when you leave here, go and just walk round until you see a patisserie, and then when you find that your heart is stirred, you see a cake that you particularly like, go to it, go and stand before the cake that you, in other words, the object of desire. Look at it and internally really feel that wanting, feel that desire, and say to yourself, I want that cake. I want that cake. I really want that cake. And she said, when you are inflamed with that desire, close the eyes, drop off the cake, and just go, I want, I want, I want. And she said, and then cut off the I. Want, 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 and go right into that. There's no object now. There is even no I who wants. There's just that complete immersion, like being in, and this is where the analogy with the alchemy comes in. It's like being in a sealed vessel. You've seen those round-bottomed vessels that you get in laboratories, and you imagine that there inside is that fire, and there's a cork firmly stuck in the top that's perhaps covered in wax as well to seal it right in, and that vessel is immensely strong now, and that fire burns, want, burns, want, burns, want, really lives that. And she said for 5 minutes, she said, if you can put up with the self-consciousness, which is another fire as well, by the way, and really do that, and you're brave enough to do that, and just see what happens, and then open your eyes, and then look at the cake again, and see if that desire is still there. And off he went, and she didn't think he would do it, but half an hour later, he came rushing back and said, it works. I just tried it and it works. I opened my eyes and it was just the cake. That feeling of temptation had completely gone. I'm cured. And she said, no, you are not cured. She said, it will return because the habit is very deeply inlaid. However, she said, the next time that the fires come up, now you have something to work with. Now you can work with them. Now you know how to actually work with them. And what she said was, look, when we start working with the fires, don't imagine that because we've worked with one fire that therefore, it comes to an end. Now I'm no longer being carried off by my temptation to eat too many cream cakes. Of course not, it will come back. But if we religiously work in that way with these fires, then what we find is that there comes a point where the whole thing comes to a head. Almost like a pimple. You know that the pimple, you get a little bit of pus underneath it, and it raises itself up from the skin, and that boil grows, and then it bursts, and all the toxin just comes out all in one go, and then you clean it, and then it just naturally heals of itself. She said it's exactly the same with these afflictions, with these attachments. She said they come to a head, and having now been burned away, it reaches a tipping point, and then the whole attachment drops off. And when that happens, she said, you can feel it in yourself. The transformation has taken place. The heart opens. There is a spaciousness that wasn't there before, that we didn't even realize was there because we're so used to the attachments. And suddenly all sorts of other little problems that I've always sort of had, which I didn't realize but were connected to that attachment, have also dropped off. And she said life then becomes something quite different. And she said this is the process of working with the fires. This is how we work with the fires. So that gives a sort of brief overview, not only of where this practice comes from, the principles that it sits upon in order for it to work, and the actual practice of it as well. Now, I've given one example only, so I want to just talk a little bit more about how we also practice in day-to-day life, because the important thing is that when working with the fires, all of us have certain big problems. For a lot of us, that's why we came into Buddhism in the first place. Let's say I have a tendency to, drink too much or smoke too much or whatever, or I have a tendency to, say things that I shouldn't. In order to try and make life easier for myself. I may be very opinionated, and it gets me into lots of trouble, even when I say things perhaps when I know I shouldn't, but I just get carried away with the moment, that sort of thing. These are examples of when the heat of the passions are so strong that they carry me away, and we think, oh, if only I could deal with that particular problem, it would, my life would be much easier. The problem with working with the fires when we start is that those fires are too big. They're just too strong, and when they come up, bang, they carry me away because they're so strong. So we have to start small. And what do we mean by starting small? It's those small, everyday, mini flare-ups that last such a small amount of time that I often don't even see them as a problem. So for example, there I am in the office. I'm just typing this important letter that that I really need to do, and someone walks in and says, "Oh, Martin, can you help me with this now, please?" And something comes up inside, a sort of pressure that goes, "Not right now, go away." Of course, we don't verbalize it. We turn and we say, "What is it?" Or perhaps we even manage a sort of half smile as we sort of push that down and go, "Yes, of course." But it's there, that no that comes up, that moment of, "Oh, not right now, blast," whatever it is. You're in the car, for example, and you're driving slowly down the street, and someone suddenly pulls out in front of you, and you put your foot on the brake. Blast you! It's that. Those little moments of fires. Those are the moments when we are needing to learn to take a breath, open up, and catch that blast you before it can come out. Now, of course, these fires are so quick that they often do escape, and 9 times out of 10 they often do. But if we persevere, we might catch one. And once we've caught one, we can catch another one as well. So a prerequisite is required for this. If we're really going to catch that fire when it comes up, then we need to be present in the body. And this is why, in that Satipatthana Sutta, the first foundation is the foundation of the physical body. And this is why in Zen we put a big emphasis of returning to the physical body, returning to the physical body. When walking down the street, instead of being off with 10,000 thoughts, past, present and future, we come back into the body. We are at one with the body, at one with the walking, with the listening, with the looking, with that real sense of being present in the body. Because until we have some kind of body awareness that at least we're there 50%, then working with the fires is virtually impossible, because the fires will carry me away. And why is it important to be in the body? Because that's where the fires come up first. If you've ever stood at a bus stop, for example, and you've been in a hurry to get somewhere and the bus hasn't come, just bring the awareness back to the body. You can feel the fire of impatience in the body as we look at the watch, and then 5 seconds later look at the watch again and go, oh, blah, where is it? And other people are looking around as well, and there's a sort of fidgeting going on, isn't there? I just want to hop from one leg to another, and I'm now thinking, well, maybe I should go for the tube, or maybe I should walk, or maybe I should call for a taxi. So there's all this energy that's being frittered away in physical movement, in physical fidgeting, and also in mental thinking as well. And all of that is the energy of the passion. All of that is the wonderful power of the Buddha nature as well. So when we catch ourselves with that, then either sit or stand still and just come back to the body. And if it means just coming back to the breath, or coming back to the feeling of the feet on the floor, but the breath is certainly ideal as well, and just sit through it. Don't try and suppress the irritation. Don't try and repress the irritation. Don't say to myself, I shouldn't feel this. Feel it. Absolutely. Feel the impatience in the thoughts. Feel the impatience in the desire to fidget and move the body and to look at the watch every 5 seconds. But really bathe in that impatient, and just really stay with it. It's the bus stop one is a very good one. I've done it many times myself. It's very useful, and when that bus finally comes, it's a very different being that gets on it from the hot-tempered, frustrated, irritable one that otherwise would be if the passions are allowed to carry me away. So there's a couple of examples, and hopefully that can give a flavour. The best thing, as I say, is to go out and try this for oneself. You know, we all know where our own pressure points are. And if we know where those pressure points are, good. They're a wonderful training opportunity. The person in the office that we don't like, the waiting for the bus, whatever those standing in the queue at the supermarket if I really don't like it, the fact that the kitchen cupboards need cleaning and I hate cleaning the kitchen cupboards, good. Sit with that hatred. But sit with that hatred whilst you're cleaning the kitchen cupboards. And this is where the practice of the timetable and also the practice of restraint obviously comes in as well. Because, you know, if there's those things, here I am full of my preferences, the things that I want to do and the things that I don't want to do. And if I'm prevented from doing the things that I want to do, then the fires flare. And if I have to do the things that I don't want to do, the fires flare. So just living an ordinary life with our normal picking and choosing that I want. I prefer this over that, but having to do all the things anyway, regardless of prizing one thing over another. All of them has to be done. I have to take the children out to the party or whatever, and I don't want to go. Perfect. Then we open up to that don't want to go. Don't want. Take a breath. We can just almost, in fact, if we can, without drawing attention to ourselves, even putting the hands together and bowing into that fire. In fact, Master Hakuin used to say that anger certainly is an afflicting passion. He said, but when it arises, do not waste that precious energy. So when we put the hands together, we can say, precious energy, please burn me away. And we can just bow into it. That physical act of bowing brings us right back into that alchemical vessel, sealed. And just for a moment, we are living in that passion without repressing it, pushing it away, pretending it's not there, nor without letting it jump out into words or speech or even thoughts. We are staying with the elemental force itself. Precious energy, please burn me away. And that is the alchemical process. That is the moment when the attachment to myself is finally being dissolved, eroded, sanded down, dissolved, whatever metaphor you want to use. That is the process of working with the fires. As I said, the clue is to start small. And what we find is that as we begin to develop some proficiency in this working with the fires, then those things that I call my big problems, suddenly when we confront them again, they seem to have been drained of a certain amount of energy, and they're not as big as they originally looked before starting this process. So hopefully that gives us all some food for thought. And as I say, Gentling the Bull is the go-to book by Venerable Myoki Oni, available from Shoboan, the Zen Center. Give it a call, give it a go. So as usual, if you have a question for troubleshooting Zen study and practice that you would like answering, please send it to, if you send it to Rinzai, RINZAI, at thezengateway.com. If you go on to the www.thezengateway.com, you'll see that there's a contact option on the top navigation menu. The details there. But yes, Rinzai at thezengateway.com if you have a question that you would like me to answer. Until the next time.